So let's dive into this stack of sources you sent over articles, research, your own notes, all pointing towards, well, one of the most debated chapters in the Bible, Revelation chapter 13.
Yeah, this chapter definitely grabs people's attention. I mean, you hear a lot about futuristic prophecies, right? Microchips, a single figure, often called the Antichrist.
For sure.
It's sparked countless interpretations over the years, often projecting it way out into a distant future.
Right. The whole idea of the mark of the beast being some kind of, I don't know, digital implant or global control system. But the material you provided suggests a completely different way of looking at this.
A very different way.
One that pulls us back, way back to the first century.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive, really guided by your sources, is to explore Revelation 13 not as a prediction of tomorrow, but through the symbolic language of the Hebrew Bible,
Okay.
particularly drawing on Daniel 7 and 9. And we're also going to ground it firmly in the historical reality of the Roman Empire in the first century.
So the specifics of that time.
Yeah, specifically around the Jewish War, and trying to see it from the perspective of the early Jewish Christian community reading it then.
So it's less about gazing into a crystal ball, more about understanding how people living through, well, profound upheaval made sense of their world.
Precisely.
This approach seems like it fundamentally challenges those common modern interpretations, doesn't it?
It really does. And it offers a powerful insight, I think, into how people at the time understood oppressive political power and, what faithfulness looked like under persecution.
Okay, let's unpack this. Maybe we should start by setting the stage, the context.
Yeah, a crucial starting point from the sources is understanding the historical context of Revelation itself. It was likely written around 95 to 100 CE.
Right.
During the reign of Emperor Domitian.
Which is significant because it's well after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE.
Absolutely.
That period was just devastating for both Jews and the early Christian community, which, let's remember, was still very much rooted in Judaism back then.
And Domitian's reign, well, it saw an increase in persecution against both groups. One specific measure mentioned in your sources is the Fiscus Judaicus tax.
Oh, yes.
This was originally a tax intended for the temple in Jerusalem, but after 70 CE, the Romans basically redirected it to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome.
So adding insult to injury?
You could say that.
Yeah.
And they imposed this on anyone practicing Jewish rites, which of course included early Jewish Christians who still followed many traditional practices.
So the people reading this letter, they weren't just speculating about future global events. They were living through recent catastrophe, the temple's destruction, and facing present hardship.
Right now, hardship, discriminatory taxes, increasing pressure from Roman authorities.
That historical grounding seems vital then.
It is. It shifts the focus away from, distant futures and shows how early believers likely understood Revelation as addressing their immediate circumstances.
And their worldview.
Their worldview was absolutely steeped in apocalyptic Jewish thought. They interpreted history as this cosmic struggle involving empires that opposed God's purposes, leading ultimately towards divine intervention.
Okay, so with that context in mind, let's get into the famous imagery. Revelation 13 introduces this beast rising from the sea.
Yeah.
Described with 10 horns, 7 heads, crowns on the horns, covered in blasphemous names. What do the sources say this represents?
Well, this imagery immediately connects back to Daniel chapter 7. You remember Daniel's vision.
Beasts from the sea, right?
Exactly. Beasts rise from the sea, symbolizing great empires emerging from kind of the turbulent realm of Gentile nations. The sea itself, in Hebrew Bible symbolism.
Or like in Isaiah or Ezekiel.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Isaiah 17, Ezekiel 38.
Yeah.
It often represents those non-Israelite nations, the chaos of the Gentile world.
So we're talking about a major power coming from the Gentile world set against God's people, and the sources connect those 10 horns with crowns specifically to Roman emperors.
Yes, the interpretation provided is that they symbolize the line of emperors starting from Julius Caesar.
Okay, marking the transition from republic to empire around 49 BCE.
Right, up to Vespasian. And Vespasian, of course, was the emperor during that crucial period of the siege and destruction of the temple in 70 CE.
Got it. And the 7 heads, that seems like a really distinct detail.
It is. The sources link the 7 heads to one of Rome's most recognizable features.
Yeah.
It's 7 hills.
Ah, literally the hills of Rome.
Literally the hills. It was this potent geographical and symbolic representation of the city itself, its political and cultural center. The sources even list them: Quirinial, Viminal, Esquiline, Capitoline, Palatine, Caelian, and Aventine.
Wow.
It grounds the vision in a very specific, identifiable place.
That makes it feel much less abstract, doesn't it? It's pointing right at Rome.
Precisely. And Rome, in this vision, isn't just another empire. It's depicted as, like, the culmination of imperial power.
Inheriting traits from before.
Exactly, inheriting characteristics from previous world powers.
Which brings us, I guess, to the description of the beast as a composite creature, body of a leopard, feet like a bear, mouth like a lion. What do these symbolize according to the sources?
Yeah, this composite imagery, it draws directly from that sequence of empires you see in Daniel's prophecies.
Okay.
The leopard-like body, swift and powerful, recalls the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great.
Makes sense, yeah.
And the sources note that Rome heavily absorbed and built upon Greek culture, their philosophy, art, religion, literature. Think of the Iliad echoing Homer. Rome projected that same kind of cultural dominance.
So it wasn't just military might, it was a cultural successor, too.
Exactly. Then you have the bear's feet. These symbolize the vast Persian Empire.
Sure.
Before Alexander, Persia was the largest empire the world had known, stretching across continents. Feet suggest, traversing great distances, covering immense territory.
Right, the sheer scale.
The scale.
Yeah.
And Rome, at its height when Revelation was written, was actually even larger.
And the lion's mouth?
That points straight to Babylon.
The empire that destroyed the first temple.
Exactly, 586 BCE. That event profoundly shaped Jewish identity and their longing for redemption, for justice against these oppressive world powers. It created that apocalyptic expectation.
And the mouth specifically. That feels significant. Pronouncements, decrees.
Well, think about it. Both Babylon and Rome made decrees that resulted in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The decree comes from the mouth, the seat of authority.
Ah, I see.
So a key point the sources make is that John of Patmos is portraying Rome not just as one empire among others, but as this terrifying synthesis.
A mashup.
Yeah, a fusion of history's most powerful and oppressive empires, the cultural legacy of Greece, the immense scale of Persia, and the destructive authority of Babylon.
Okay.
This perspective helps explain why Daniel's fourth beast was described as uniquely terrible, indescribable. Don is basically saying, this is it. Rome embodies that.
So it's a symbolic indictment of Roman power, not some literal monster.
Right.
Okay, now let's tackle the mortal wound that was healed. Another passage people interpret in all sorts of ways today.
Right. And according to the sources you provided, this passage is strongly connected to Emperor Nero.
Okay, Nero. Ruled 54 to 68 CE.
Infamous for.
The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, mainly.
And he blamed the Christians for it, right? Leading to horrific persecution.
He did. He scapegoated them. Now, after Nero's death by suicide in 68 CE, a pervasive rumor spread throughout the empire. It was especially strong in the eastern provinces, like near Patmos, where John was.
What was the rumor?
It was the Nero Redivivus legend, literally, Nero revived.
Hero revived.
Yeah, the belief that he hadn't truly died, but would return, possibly from exile over in Parthia, to reclaim his throne. And get this, figures claiming to be Nero actually did lead rebellions from that region.
No way. That legend must have been incredibly powerful then. Fostering fear, maybe false hope.
Absolutely. So the mortal wound healed can be seen as a symbolic reference to this persistent rumor, this fear of Nero's return. It represents the perceived invincibility, the terrifying resilience of Roman imperial power.
That even after chaos and Nero's death, the oppressive system just comes back. It bounces back. Or it could also be interpreted metaphorically.
How so?
Well, perhaps seeing Domitian, the current emperor, when Revelation was likely written, as a kind of new Nero.
Because he was also cracking down hard.
Exactly. Given his own harsh treatment of Jews and Jewish Christians. That's another possibility the sources raise.
Interesting.
So what this interpretation highlights is that Nero becomes this archetype of cruel imperial authority. It links the persecution believers faced directly to the nature of Roman rule itself.
And that perspective really challenges the idea that this passage is about some single future individual called Antichrist, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It roots it instead in the immediate historical experience of the audience.
Okay. Let's move on to the blasphemies the beast speaks, and that specific time frame mentioned 42 mots. What did the sources connect these to?
The blasphemies are understood as referring to Roman actions, most notably the desecration of the Jerusalem temple during its destruction by Titus.
Vespasian's son, in 70 CE.
Right. The sources mention the historian Josephus, who documented the Jewish war. He described the immense destruction and, well, the defilement of sacred spaces.
And one detail your sources include is particularly shocking. Titus laying with a prostitute.
On a Torah scroll inside the temple itself.
Yes. That would be seen as the ultimate act of blasphemy, a declaration of Rome's dominance over Israel's law.
It's a powerful, deeply disturbing image. It shows the depth of Roman contempt, or at least how it was perceived. And the 42 months,
For 3.5 years.
yeah, that time frame mentioned in Revelation 13 is symbolic. It's a period you find repeatedly in Jewish apocalyptic literature.
Like in Daniel again.
Exactly, Daniel 7.25 and 9.27. It represents this finite but incredibly intense period of tribulation and oppression for God's people.
And if we look at the historical timeline, the Jewish War, starting around 66 CE, the fall of Jerusalem and the Temple in 70 CE.
That's approximately 3.5 years? Or 42 months? The sources draw that direct parallel. And what's also interesting is how this time frame aligns with the chaos of 69 CE.
The year of the four emperors.
Right. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian. That period of rapid succession, civil war, before Vespasian finally restored stability. Remember Daniel 7?
Vaguely. Something about horns.
Daniel 7 mentions 3 horns being plucked out before a dominant one emerges.
Daniel 7.8.
Yeah. The sources suggest you can see that as paralleling the removal of those 3 emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, before Vespasian consolidated power.
So the 42 months wasn't just some random number for John's audience. It corresponded closely to the duration of the war, the period of intense suffering and Roman dominance they had just lived through, or were still reeling from.
Exactly. And for a community steeped in Jewish eschatology, there was a strong expectation that after the final oppressive Gentile kingdom fell,
The Messianic age would begin.
right. Many apocalyptic Jews and early Christians saw Rome's rise, and especially the temple's destruction, as signs that this transition was imminent.
Considering the sheer scale of that conflict, Roman legions besieging Jerusalem, 60,000 troops, and Josephus estimated Jewish casualties over 1 million.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering. It's clear why this period would feel like a cataclysmic, world-ending event for those involved.
Which leads us to the persecution described the beast waging war against the saints. Who are the saints here?
In this context, the sources understand saints as faithful Jews and, by extension, Jewish Christians, those who refuse to compromise their loyalty to God.
Particularly by refusing emperor worship.
That was a key issue, yes. This aligns directly with Daniel 7.21, which also depicts the beast persecuting God's holy people.
And historically, we know early Christians, often seen initially as just a Jewish sect, faced arrest, torture, execution under Roman authority.
Absolutely. Notably under Nero and later under Domitian. And the sources are clear this persecution included Jews as well.
So a key takeaway here from the sources is that Revelation 13 isn't just describing what the beast does.
No, it's a call to faithful endurance for the audience facing this reality. It echoes themes you find all through Jewish apocalyptic writings, emphasizing remaining steadfast, even when suffering is severe.
And suffering wasn't just random, was it? Within Jewish thought, it was often seen as a trial, a furnace of refinement.
Preparing the community for ultimate vindication. Yeah, that idea of suffering having a purpose was strong.
And the scale of impact was just immense. Hundreds martyred in Rome under Nero, over 1 million Jewish casualties in the war.
Undeniable. So the passage functions both as a warning, look how intense the opposition is, and as this powerful encouragement to maintain loyalty to God, despite the pressure, despite the violence.
Okay, now let's turn to the second beast. This one rises from the earth. In many modern readings, this is the false prophet, right? A single figure.
That's the common view today. But what's interesting here is that the sources interpret this second beast differently.
How so?
Not as a single person, but as the system. The personnel responsible for enforcing the emperor cult throughout the Roman Empire.
So the local officials, the provincial priests, the enforcers.
Exactly. The authorities who compelled participation in emperor worship.
Okay, so it's the apparatus that made emperor worship compulsory. Tell us more about that cult.
Well, the imperial cult was a fundamental part of Roman life, especially out in the provinces. It involved worshiping the emperor, or sometimes the emperor and Rome, as divine or semi-divine.
Kind of like Pharaoh back in Egypt, or Augustus being deified.
Similar idea, yeah. Part of the pagan ruler worship tradition.
And this wasn't optional.
Generally, no.
Yeah.
Participation was pretty much compulsory, particularly in places like Asia Minor, where John was exiled. The sources mention that by the end of the 1st century, there were over 35 temples dedicated just to Roman emperors in Asia Minor alone.
Wow.
And cities that were particularly loyal or important got this special honorific title, Neokoros, for hosting these imperial temples. Ephesus was one. It showed political loyalty through religious practice.
It sounds less like personal piety and more like a loyalty test to the state.
That's exactly what it was. The sources really emphasized the complete lack of separation between religion and government in Roman society. There was no church and state divide.
Right.
The imperial cult was a primary tool for political control and social cohesion. And the second piece's ability to perform signs and compel worship, that just underscores this integration of religion and politics. Emperors were sometimes even said to perform miraculous acts, healing the blind, things like that, as part of their supposed divine status.
So the second beast represents the power structure that forced people to show allegiance to Rome through these religious acts. Which brings us to maybe the most discussed element of all, the mark of the beast.
Yes.
This is where the microchip idea usually pops up.
It is. And according to your sources, that futuristic technological interpretation really isn't what the text would have meant to its original audience.
So what then?
The mark is understood as a symbol of allegiance to Rome, and probably represented by a form of branding or tattooing.
Branding or tattooing, like literally.
Yeah, which was a common practice back then, particularly for identifying ownership or status.
Like a mark of ownership?
Precisely. The sources give some compelling examples. Slaves were often branded or tattooed on the forehead, sometimes with marks like fugitivus runaway to deter escape and show who owned them.
Okay.
And Roman soldiers, they were frequently tattooed with SPQR,
Senatus Populusca Romanus.
the Senate and people of Rome,
Yeah.
often on their arms. It symbolized their allegiance to the state, their legion.
Mhm.
You can see SPQR on things like the Arch of Titus even today,
And Revelation says the mark is on the forehead or the right hand.
which aligns really well with these Roman practices, doesn't it? Slaves on the forehead, soldiers often on the forearm or right hand.
Okay, that fits.
And what's striking is the contrast presented earlier in Revelation back in chapter 7. The righteous are sealed, or tattooed, with God's name on their foreheads.
So it feels like two competing claims of ownership. Whose mark do you bear?
Exactly. It's about allegiance. And this connects directly to the Hebrew word eved.
Meaning servant or slave.
Servant or slave, yes. Throughout the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, Israel is called the Eved Hashem, the servant or slave of God. It signifies where their ultimate allegiance lies. John is using this really familiar convention to frame the central choice facing his audience. Whose servant are you, God's or Rome's?
Wow. Okay. And finally, the number of the beast, 666, called the number of a man, or a human number. Our sources mention some ancient manuscripts have 616 instead.
Right, there's that variation. But a key insight from the sources is interpreting this number using gematria.
Gematria, the Hebrew practice of assigning numerical values to letters.
That's the one. And 666 is understood as a gematria cipher for Nero Caesar.
Nero Caesar, how does that work?
Well, the sources spell it out using the Hebrew letters for Neron Kaiser. So you have Nun, which is 50, plus Resh, 200, plus Vav, 6, plus Nun, 50, plus Kof, 100, plus Samek, 60, plus Resh, 200. Incredibly direct. And this 616 variation, that likely reflects a slight spelling difference. Maybe a Latinized version of Nero's name, where the final N sound, the final Nun, is omitted. That changes the total value just enough.
So the number isn't some cryptic future riddle. It's a coded identifier pointing straight to Nero and through him to the Roman Empire itself.
Precisely. This interpretation really underscores that the mark and the number represent that fundamental choice in the first century. Loyalty to Rome and his figurehead, epitomized by Nero, or loyalty to God.
It seems like without understanding this historical context, the Hebrew symbolism practices like gematria, the original meaning of Revelation 13 just gets lost.
It gets completely lost, yeah, and easily misplaced onto modern scenarios that just don't fit the original context.
This whole deep dive, really guided by the sources you shared, it truly transforms how we might understand Revelation 13.
It really shifts it, doesn't it?
Mhm.
From a cryptic future prophecy to this powerful, historically grounded Jewish-Christian critique of first-century Roman imperial power.
Rooted deeply in the symbolic language of Daniel. The beast isn't just some monster, it's this complex symbol for the Roman Empire itself, portraying it as, like you said, a fusion of previous oppressive world powers.
Carrying the cultural weight of Greece, the vast reach of Persia, and the destructive decree of Babylon.
And at its heart, the text is a call. A call for faithfulness, for perseverance, for people facing real, intense persecution.
It resonates with those deep Jewish hopes for God's ultimate justice against empires that seemed absolutely invincible.
So instead of being primarily about future microchips or some single Antichrist figure in our time, it was a vital message then to believers living under the heel of Rome, urging them to stay loyal to God.
Understanding that historical and symbolic context, it just unlocks the original power and relevance of the text, and it reveals the immense courage it must have taken for those early Jewish Christian communities.
To see the world's most powerful empire through this critical lens.
And remain faithful despite everything.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? I mean, how does seeing Revelation 13 as a message specifically to the first century audience change your perspective on other apocalyptic texts?
That's a great question.
Or maybe what lessons about resisting oppressive power and maintaining faith, even when it costs dearly, can we actually draw from this historical interpretation today?
Powerful questions to consider, absolutely. And thank you for sharing these sources with us. They really made this deep dive possible.